Hello, this is Robert Romano, Vice President of Public Policy with Americans for Limited Government and Americans for Limited Government Foundation. Hello, welcome to another Americans for Limited Government live stream. Today we're going to be talking about Senator Mitt Romney. Republican Senator of Utah has endorsed U.S. Representative Congresswoman Liz Cheney, who is locked in a tough primary battle this year in Wyoming that will take place on August 16th. She's running against about 5 other people here. And Mitt Romney saying that this primary in Wyoming could be the most important in the country. Liz Cheney saying this is the most important race in 2022. Mitt Romney saying that this could be essential to, quote, preserving liberal democracy. Which, it's the Wyoming at-large congressional seat. Republicans have held that historically. They usually win with about 65% of the vote for that seat. So whether Liz Cheney wins the primary or not, Republicans are very likely to keep this seat in November. So I doubt it's the most important race of the year. That's probably pretty self-serving on Liz Cheney's part. And Mitt Romney to say this has something to do with preserving liberal democracy, I think is probably false as well. Definitely an exaggeration. And we're going to cover a lot of that today. He's just held a fundraiser, Mitt Romney did, for the Liz Cheney fundraising reception honoring Congresswoman Liz Cheney with special guest Mitt Romney. This was on March 14th. There were a bunch of people hosting it, Bobby and Bill Kilberg, a lot of other guests. It was a VIP reception for $10,800 per couple, a photo reception, $5,800 per couple, and a general reception was $1,000 per individual. So this was in McLean. This took place already. They raised a few $100,000 for Liz Cheney's reelection bid, which could come to a grinding halt on August 16th when this primary happens. Here you can see the United States House of Representatives election in Wyoming in 2022. There are several candidates in the primary. You have Liz Cheney, also Robin Belinsky, Anthony Bouchard, Harriet Hageman, Brian Keller, and Denton Knapp. Now, as for those candidates, I believe that President Donald Trump is endorsing Harriet Hageman. And there it is right there. Trump endorses Harriet Hageman in GOP primary challenge to Liz Cheney. And the love lost between there's no love lost between Trump and Cheney or Romney. Cheney voted to impeach President Trump, former President Trump, and Romney voted to convict him. Now, the Senate voted to acquit Trump of all charges, so he was found to be not guilty. And in endorsing Hageman, Trump said, quote, "I strongly endorse Republican House of Representatives candidate Harriet Hageman from Wyoming, who is running against warmonger and disloyal Republican Liz Cheney." Now, Cheney was removed as the House Republican Conference Chair in May of 2021, largely, coming from grassroots pressure, largely owing to her vote to impeach President Trump. And I think we have some audio here so you can be reminded of what Trump actually said at the January 6th Save America rally. We could bring that up real quick. Trump called for protesters to, peacefully challenge the certification of Joe Biden as president on that day. But Biden was certified. There were people who were peacefully protesting, but unfortunately there was the January 6th riot that took place. But here's what Trump said that he was impeached for.
We have come to demand that Congress do the right thing and only count the electors who have been lawfully slated. I know that everyone here will soon be marching over to the Capitol building to peacefully and patriotically make your voices heard today.
And so there he said it, peacefully and patriotically make your voices heard. But when you look at the articles of impeachment for Donald Trump that were ratified, it was for incitement of insurrection. And reading through that part right there in the article, it said, quote, that the president, quote, willfully made statements that in context encouraged and foreseeably resulted in lawless action at the Capitol. And again, we heard what Trump said. He didn't incite violence. He was saying that to peacefully and patriotically make your voices heard. Let's go to the chat here. We have Kathy Morrell. Mittens is a pussy. Okay. Viola Demarak. Mitt Romney needs to go along with Mitch McConnell. Okay. Caroline Fargnoli Feely. Mitt certainly seems to think he's relevant or that conservatives still listen to him. I don't believe that either are the case. Tracy Pennington Lee, thank you. Both need to go. Frank Politano. They are loser Republicans. They are too. Yeah, there are just two of them, apparently. But yeah, President Trump said to peacefully and patriotically make your voice heard. And then if you look at these Justice Department indictments for the people they're actually charging for the breaking into the Capitol with the riot, they're alleging that the perpetrators have been planning it for weeks and days and weeks before the rally, the Save America rally, ever occurred. And that includes a January 2021 indictment that came by before Trump's impeachment trial was even heard by Congress in the Senate, which didn't happen until after he left office. So they weren't even going to try to, quote unquote, remove him under the Constitution until after he already left office, rendering the Senate trial moot and as a moot point and just as a waste of time. Like, this is what Liz Cheney and Mitt Romney think we need to waste our time in. In any event, the indictments that the FBI and the Justice Department are actually pursuing right now, pursuant to prosecuting people for the January 6, 2021 Capitol riot, they say it was premeditated. And so the article of impeachment, Trump definitely, I think, got off the hook because everyone knew it was premeditated at the time because of those FBI and Justice Department indictments. But he couldn't have encouraged and as a spontaneous result of his speech had the riot occurred. Clearly, the people who were doing that, they had violence in their minds for days and weeks prior to the rally. So the speech itself was not incitement. And so the Senate found Trump to be not guilty. And if that was the end of the story, maybe, Liz Cheney and Mitt Romney, people would care a lot less about that. But afterwards, Cheney and U.S. Representative Adam Kinzinger out of Illinois, who also voted to impeach Trump, they then volunteered to serve on the House of Representatives Select Committee on January 6th, which is, going against what Republicans are saying in the House minority. Kevin McCarthy, the House minority leader, he boycotted the January 6th committee because Nancy Pelosi, House Speaker, would not let him put his people on it. He wanted to have, conservative Republicans, some of them, on this committee if there was going to be Republican participation in this. And instead, Nancy Pelosi said, no, you can't have Jim Jordan and a few other guys on this committee. So McCarthy said, then we're not participating if we don't get to have our people on this committee. So what happened then was Cheney and Kinzinger, they volunteered for the committee and basically bucking what Kevin McCarthy had done. And then Pelosi made Liz Cheney the vice chairman of this of this committee. And so it's kind of predictably led, McCarthy pulls his people. Now Trump allies are encouraging and urging McCarthy to remove Kinzinger and Cheney from the House GOP conference altogether for serving on this committee. It's like, well, what's wrong with serving on the select committee? And this Politico piece, I highly recommend. Go to Google, check this out. Capitol Police examines backgrounds, social media feeds of some who meet with lawmakers. After January 6th, you see House Speaker Nancy Pelosi tasked the Capitol Police Department and its intelligence division to begin screening people who were meeting with members of Congress, also screening their staff. And this is without them being accused of any crimes. Quote, the little known new practice by the department's intelligence analyst instituted since the January 6th attack is highly controversial given the civil liberties concerns it raises. Yeah, I would say these are civil liberties violations of congressional staff, members of Congress, and their constituents if they happen to be visiting with their congressmen. Suddenly everything going on at the House of Representatives and the Senate is suspect. I think that's that's not the democracy and the republic that we're used to working with here. Here's Wisey endorses Liz Cheney for House seat, but I think they should run as Democrats. Otherwise, the race will be Democrat versus Democrat. Well, that's an interesting point. I think if you look at particularly Mitt Romney's poll numbers in Utah right now, they take this headline, Deseret News, are Republicans showing Mitt Romney more love? New Utah poll has the answers. And then you go into the poll, it says that he's at 51% approval rating for amongst Republicans and Democrats. But get this, 45% of Republicans in Utah disapprove of Mitt Romney. That's pretty horrible. That's pretty terrible. When you compare that to somebody like Donald Trump's overall favorability with the Republican Party, this is a Fox News poll, was 82% and only 17% unfavorable. So that's what you'd expect for the party leader, the former president, 80, 90% approval or favorability. That probably gives Trump a pretty good leg up if should he decide to run in 2024. But suffice to say, Trump is a lot more popular amongst the Republicans than Mitt Romney is. 45% of Republicans disapprove of Mitt Romney. And in a straw poll that was conducted in Wyoming amongst the state committee there, Harriet Hageman defeats Liz Cheney by, 59 votes to Cheney's 6 votes in this Wyoming Republican State Central Committee. In January, they did a straw poll, and it turns out that the state party is very anxious not to have Liz Cheney representing them in Congress in 2023. And I think that's because not only that she voted to impeach Trump, but that they did so under the most dubious grounds. This idea that it was incitement, but then you look at the speech and Trump never actually advocated for violence. And then you learn from the Justice Department that the perpetrators of the riot had done so on a premeditated, pre-planned basis. So there was no coordination with Trump, and nothing he said at the speech mattered because the riot actually began by these perpetrators while Trump was still speaking, like a quarter mile away or half mile away, whatever it was. But it wasn't connected to the event. And I think that's very important. We don't need members of Congress who think it's a good idea to waste Congress's time and the American people's time with nonsense impeachments. That's abusing the Article 1 power. And considering the fact that Trump was merely exercising his First Amendment right to speech to say peacefully protest the certification of Biden. Well, every single time there's an inauguration, or even prior to that, when you have these certifications, there are always objections raised. In 2016, 2017, when Trump won, there were objections raised on the floor of Congress, and they were shot down, just as the objections in 2020 were shot down by Congress. There were a few votes that there would have been more votes on the objections had the riot not occurred. That was unfortunate, and I think it showed that it was counterproductive. In fact, there would have been more objections heard, but for the riot. Let's go back to the chat here. Tom Snyder says, this is one reason Romney lost in 2012. He always projects himself as a pro-family Republican conservative, but his record in Massachusetts and now his record in Congress show this was just a big lie. He goes on. A New York Times reporter just admitted in private that there were FBI informants at the January 6th protest in the Capitol. That's interesting. Recently, a protester at the Capitol committed suicide because they kept delaying his trial. That's true. It's definitely a tragedy. He didn't break any windows. He didn't hit a cop. He was let into the building. Well, I think this is a very important point. So here we're establishing from the Justice Department's own findings that these crimes that were committed, the people who wanted to break into the Capitol did so on a premeditated basis. And then a lot of people followed them in afterwards, and they were taking selfies. And the Justice Department is prosecuting some of those people who just went in there and weren't breaking anything with equal fervor as they're going after the perpetrators who did go there on a premeditated basis. And, if it's me, I would, the exercising prosecutorial discretion, they should probably look for the people who had a premeditated and or were committing violence. People who just wandered in there, they should probably leave those people alone. And I think that would probably, make people think that this was less about partisan politics. Because then you're prioritizing law enforcement and the capacity for people who are actually behaving violently, who were breaking windows and such. Wow, chat's on fire right now. Let's see here. Caroline Forgnoli-Feely says, quote, is it true that the people that were held for the insurrection are still being held? There are some people who are still being held, and, the trials are moving forward now. But for many weeks and months, some of them were unable to be in contact with their attorneys. And so I thought that there was definite deprivations of liberty without due process, that on appeal, some of these convictions may eventually end up being overturned because Washington, D.C. is so thoroughly abusing these people's rights. That said, there were people who did act violently at the riot and who did so on a premeditated basis. And that's why everyone else is, frankly, getting in trouble right now. A lot of people walked into that building. They shouldn't have been there. That probably was a violation. But if people kind of peacefully wandered in and then wandered out, I don't think those people should be prosecuted. That's my opinion. Rich Isgro. Romney was so weak when he ran against Obama, but Romney did say Russia was a threat back when he was run against Obama, for which Obama mocked Romney. Typical leftist ploy, mock what you disagree, even when you're wrong. Thank you, Rich. And we also have Pat Neal here. Yeah, but Romney's been a cluster dem for a while now. Now, this is interesting. He clearly has higher approval ratings, approval ratings amongst Democrats than your typical Republican. So again, he has about 51% approval amongst Democrats. Mitt Romney does. And so could that hurt him when he runs for reelection? Maybe. But clearly Democrats like Mitt Romney because he tends to vote with Democrats on issues like impeachment. It's up to Republicans to decide if that represents them or not. I think that, Cheney and Romney are, they thought that Trump was going to not be a part of the party anymore or something. And I think Trump has something to say about that. I think Trump supporters who still want President Trump to return to office, if should he run in 2024, I think they might have something to say about that. Here's Tom Snyder, political prisoners. Just wondering. Well, I mean, at some point, people who are being locked up, just for wandering into the Capitol, and the only common thread to tie them is the fact that they supported President Trump and they thought that there was something wrong with the election. People have a right to protest the certification of an election. That's not a threat to democracy. That's a part of the process. The certification in Congress is provided for under federal law, as is the objection process. Members of Congress are allowed to raise objections. A House member can do it, seconded by the Senate. Then the House and the Senate break off, and they're supposed to convene under federal law to consider, due diligence, the objections to the Electoral College count as presented to Congress. On January 6th, that was the process. And members and constituents, they had weeks to contact their members of Congress to tell them to oppose certification. This is like any other vote in Congress, like they're voting on a bill, or they're voting for majority leader, or they're voting for speaker. You can talk to your members of Congress and tell them how you think they should be voting on any of those issues, including certification of the Electoral College. This is, basically in and of itself, it wasn't important. The fact that there was this rally and the riots, what then leads to the impeachment and then these imprisonments. And there are people being prosecuted. There were people who were violent. So I can't say the Justice Department is wrong for going after people who were, premeditated trying to break into the U.S. Capitol. But clearly there's a lot of, I think, innocent people who were getting caught up in that, who were not acting on a premeditated or violent basis. Caroline Forgnoli-Feely, agree. Thank you. Thank you, Caroline. Thanks for listening. Wisey says, McCain, John Kerry, Romney were all rhino candidates. All our past elections were all doomed either way it goes. One of the reasons I think former President Trump did so well in 2016 was, he wasn't a career politician, and people were looking for someone who could kind of talk straight with them. And I think Trump was kind of, he talks in a very casual New York way, so you kind of know exactly what he's thinking. He didn't pull any punches. And in the meantime, prior Republican nominees, some felt that they were too milquetoast, that they didn't fight, that they would just let the media lie about them and there would be no response. Trump said, no, I'm going to respond to everything. And so a lot of GOP establishment would say, you're punching down. But that was his style. It worked for him in 2016 when he creamed the Republican field and got the nomination pretty easily after he won New Hampshire and South Carolina. He was well on his way. And so, people feel very strongly. I think that McCain, Kerry, John Kerry. Well, John Kerry's not a rhino. He's a Democrat. I missed that one. John Kerry, he was the Democrat nominee in 2004 against George W. Bush. Kerry lost. Here's Blaine Ney. I can think of a few politicians who should change their political parties: Liz Cheney, Mitt Romney, Tulsi Gabbard, Kirsten Sinema, Joe Manchin, and Spencer Cox. Yeah, no, that's a fair point too. The way that a lot of Republicans feel about Mitt Romney or Liz Cheney is probably the same way a lot of Democrats are feeling about Joe Manchin and Kirsten Sinema right now. They can't get much of anything done, the Democrats, on the legislative side. I think if you go by the size of congressional majorities, 50-50 in the Senate, I think a 5-seat majority in the House, that makes Joe Biden the weakest first-term Democratic president in American history since Grover Cleveland. You have to go back that far. Democrats usually, in modern history, win a trifecta, and they usually win pretty sizable majorities in the House and the Senate, sometimes filibuster-proof majorities in the Senate. Barack Obama had a filibuster-proof majority in the Senate, eventually, thanks to Arlen Specter. Bill Clinton did not have a filibuster-proof majority in the Senate, but Jimmy Carter did, LBJ did, I think Kennedy did as well. Truman did, FDR did. And so the Democrats are used to getting their way, particularly in the first few years of a Democratic administration in Congress. So Manchin and Sinema, do they even have the votes? Does Pelosi and Schumer, do they have the votes to even repeal, say, the Trump tax cuts? Could you imagine if they failed to repeal those with the Democratic House, Senate, and White House? That would be pretty unbelievable. But it's a real possibility because of, people say they're moderates. I think they're pretty liberal, Sinema and Manchin, liberal Democrats, but they live in pretty marginal states. So, states that Trump did pretty well in. So they probably think that, I need to not support Biden so much, or I could not get reelected. Some factor of that. They need Republicans to vote for them in order to get reelected. And so big spending bills like the Build Back Better plan are now dead. That was going to cost over $3 trillion. The $1.5 trillion omnibus bill just passed, but that was on a bipartisan basis. There's still enough Republicans who want to do these big spending bills in Congress, unfortunately. But the rest of the legislative agenda, make Puerto Rico or DC states, that's gone. Green New Deal legislatively, that's pretty much gone. Healthcare public option, that's pretty much gone. Packing the Supreme Court, that's not happening. So up and down the line, the Biden legislative agenda, I think, is struggling. Republicans are primed to do pretty well in the 2022 midterms, which by default, I mean, on average, the out party, that's the Republicans right now, they tend to pick up about 30 seats in the House and about 3 seats in the Senate during midterms. So Biden's the incumbent. Biden and the Democrats, they're the incumbents. They tend to lose about 30 seats in the House or 3 seats in the Senate. That would be more than enough for Republicans to reclaim their majorities. And the question is, do figures like Mitt Romney and Liz Cheney, do they have a place in that world? Here is Todd Glazer. Well, we aren't voting for her this time around, guaranteed. I guess speaking about Liz Cheney, yeah, I mean, Republicans, it's pretty easy to win the Republican seat if you get past the primary to win the House seat in Wyoming. You're going to get like 60 or 65% of the vote. Let's see here. We have Chuck Haggard here. President mentioned 81 million is baloney. Okay. Richard Benfield, sorry to admit I voted for Romney, an error I will never make again. Yeah, I mean, a lot of people, it's like, what's Mitt Romney up to? What's Liz Cheney up to? It's like they set their political careers on fire in order to go against Trump. But I think, they've been involved with an intra-party civil war. I think that began when Trump was still, when he was still running, when he announced his candidacy. There was a pitched effort amongst the establishment Republicans in Washington, D.C., to make certain that Trump didn't get the nomination. The people in the party, the Republicans, they decided they did want Trump to be their nominee. And he was nominated, and he went on to win the election against Hillary Clinton, despite being, not largely disfavored by the odds makers. But I think Trump won, a pretty decisive victory there by picking up Rust Belt states that had traditionally voted Democrat, like Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin. He also picked up Ohio. Republicans usually win Ohio when they win the presidency. And he did well, and when won Florida and North Carolina. Trump clearly has also had coattails. Republicans actually picked up several seats in the House in 2020, such that it's a very slim majority. And so Trump barely lost the election in 2020. He lost by about 43,000 votes, 20,000 in 23,000 in Wisconsin, 10,000 in Arizona, 10,000 in Georgia. It's a very slim margin for Biden. And so, but that plus how things are going right now, 7.9% inflation, right? The economy's overheating. We could see another recession. You see the disasters that have taken place vis-a-vis foreign policy. In Afghanistan, the withdrawal there was a catastrophe. Biden's been upside down on his approval rating ever since then. And so Trump is probably licking his chops right now. And I think on August 16th, we're going to find out if Trump still has coattails. Does the Trump selection for Wyoming's at-large seat, Harriet Hageman, does she defeat Liz Cheney, Mitt Romney's choice? And you could take your bets there. If you think that, Hageman's going to win, you're probably happy that Romney endorsed her the way he has. Because I don't think this helps Liz Cheney, quite honestly. To have the impeachment Republicans kind of all grouped together and they're supporting one another. But in the meantime, 80% of Republicans still have a favorable view of former President Trump. I think politically, this is a catastrophe for Liz Cheney and for Mitt Romney. Let's see, we have a few more commenters here. We've been going for about a half hour now, so I'm going to start to wind things down here. When is Romney just going to switch parties? There could be a primary or a convention there in Utah if he's particularly unpopular with Republicans. But it still seems that about half of the Republicans in Utah still support Mitt Romney, going by the polling there, 51% approval amongst Utah Republicans, 51% of Democrats in Utah support him too. But 42% of Utahns disapprove, and that included 45% of Republicans, 37% of Democrats, and they don't give you the independence breakdown there. But there it is, Mitt Romney. Are the Republicans showing him some new love? Well, maybe these numbers are actually up from where he was or something, because they're making it sound like his numbers are actually improving. Um, but I'm not seeing any evidence that Republicans have been fond of him, particularly since he started taking stands against former President Trump while he was still in office. And then the impeachment vote, I think a lot of Republicans are just getting very sour. A lot of Republicans really liked former President Trump. And so I think the impeachment was very divisive on those members of Congress that voted to impeach. Here's Robert Thomas. OMG, Mitt Romney is the most disingenuous, fake person on the planet. Ouch. Man, I mean, I'm not getting any love here for Liz Cheney or Mitt Romney. So maybe you agree with former President Trump and Harriet Hageman, and you have a particular view of how this race should go, and what kinds of Republicans should be representing the GOP in 2023. And I think just the message that voters are sending, if this straw poll is accurate out of Wyoming, state parties are saying the same thing, is they don't want anti-Trump Republicans to be, making Republican candidates look bad on the ballot in 2022. Trump is strongly indicating he might run again. And because he's a former president, he probably has a pretty good chance of getting nominated. And Republicans don't want to, harm his chances to be leading the top of the ticket. And I think the GOP, just its own self-awareness and its self-interest, will dictate that you're not going to want to have members of Congress who are kneecapping party leadership in this capacity. And that's exactly what Liz Cheney did. That's why she was removed as House Republican Conference Chair. The fact that she's serving as January 6th committee vice chairman, I think is just adds insult to injury. Republicans are not getting a fair shake there. And as I mentioned, that committee is said to be violating the civil liberties of congressional staff and constituents. Anyone who happens to meet with a member of Congress or their staffs up on the Hill, they're vetting everything. And so, why does Nancy Pelosi need an intelligence division? I think this is an egregious abuse of power. And should Republicans reclaim the majority this year, obviously Americans for Limited Government would support, not having congressional staffs and constituents spied on by Capitol Police. I think that's an egregious abuse of power. We'll see a couple more chats here, and then we'll close things out. Dennis Becker. Romney has sucked since he gave Obama his second term. To be fair, I think Obama was pretty likely to win his second term, just based on how weak Romney was in the primary. There was a divided primary that year on the Republican side. So not all Republicans were fully on board with Romney, probably owing to the fact that he invented the individual mandate for healthcare in Massachusetts when he was governor there. And so that was the thing that most Republicans hated about Obamacare. So could you think of a less a worse candidate to run against Obama and Obamacare than the Republican who agreed with Obama on the individual mandate? I thought that never jived. And here's one more chat. Viola Demerick, Caroline Fargnoli, Feely, yes. So Viola agrees with Caroline. All right. Glad to see you guys are talking to one another, getting to know one another in the Americans for Limited Government chat. We love the chat. We love you guys. Thank you so much for joining us. Hit that subscribe button. And I'll just give you the close here. Does the fate of, here's what Mitt Romney's saying. He's saying that the Cheney primary is somehow a part of preserving liberal democracy all over the world. Quote, we are really the only significant experiment in democracy, and preserving liberal democracy is an extraordinary challenge. People of character and courage have stood up for right at times when others want to look away. Such a person is Liz Cheney, who for her part is saying that this is, quote, the most important House race in the country in 2022, her primary. It's pretty self-serving. It's not the most important race. Republicans will win that seat easily. And and if she loses the primary, apparently Republican voters won't miss her either. So I don't think this is essential to preserving liberal democracy. And I don't think it's the most important election of the year. What is really at stake are the political futures of figures like Romney and Cheney, who have been embroiled in a GOP inter-party civil war that began when Trump announced his presidential campaign in 2015. Here's Roxanne Allen. Please, people of Utah, stop voting for Romney. He doesn't have your best interest, and it doesn't support America. Well, thank you for that comment, Roxanne. Blaine Ney says, as a Utah resident, I dare say that Mitt's Republican support is almost entirely in the Salt Lake Valley, which votes blue. Well, clearly, according to the polling, there is a lot of Democrats supporting him there. And if he were to be reelected, it would probably be with Democrat votes. That's the model that some Republican senators will opt for, is to be kind of this Republican independent guy. Senators like Susan Collins. A lot of Democrats will vote for her up in Maine. And you think of, Olympia Snow before her, that there's these few kind of liberal Republican seats. And so I guess we have to say Romney's a liberal Republican by today's standards. And I'll leave you with the close here. What we're seeing now, though, is what's at stake are the political futures of figures like Romney and Cheney. What we're seeing are the death throes of the Never Trump faction. And after January 6th, I think figures like Romney, like Liz Cheney, they bet big that the future of the Republican Party would not include former President Donald Trump. Were they wrong? He might run again in 2024. Now, if Cheney loses, she and Romney could discover that the war for the heart and soul of the Republican Party is over. Trump won. On August 16th, Wyomingites will have their say. Tom Snyder says, we're not going to talk about Mormons. We love our Mormons. We love Americans, patriotic Americans of every religion. Please, guys, be nice to one another. People have different views on religions. Why the First Amendment was so important. That's why we don't want religious tests or anything like that. But yeah, on August 16th, Wyomingites will have their say about whether they want Liz Cheney to still represent the Republican Party in Congress. And that's the commentary. This is Robert Romano, Vice President of Public Policy with Americans for Limited Government and Americans for Limited Government Foundation. Hit that subscribe button, ring the bell for notifications, and have a good day.